For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and socially. In the midst of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other than human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. There's still time to reconnect with what we've lost, to restore our broken relationship to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. I first learned about animism in the book The Story of Bee by Daniel Quinn. While the term animism was initially invented by anthropologists as a way of classifying place-based indigenous religions the world over, it has taken on a much deeper and expansive meaning in recent years. In many ways, it transcends the notion of religion or spirituality to more of an ecological ethos encoded in stories to shape a person's perception of the environment in terms of reciprocity. For this reason, animism is a prevalent way of perceiving and engaging with the world in the rewilding movement. Through animism, we can once more find belonging to people and place and align ourselves with the cycles and systems of the ecologies where we dwell. Here to discuss the topic of animism with me today is Rune Hjarnø Rasmussen. Rune is an historian of religion, PhD, educated from the universities of Uppsala and Copenhagen. Rune has lived in many countries and done fieldwork in a number of contemporary, primarily Afro-descendant religions, but since childhood has had Nordic religion as a strong field of interest. Today, Rune is working on applying contemporary developments in anthropology to rethink the way we address Nordic religion, both in terms of scholarship, but also as a reservoir of cultural knowledge for environmental activism and sustainability sensitization. Rune Hjarnø, I can't do it.
That's okay, already. Man.
Hjarnø. Ongoing work on developing the Nordic Animism perspective can be supported through his Patreon profile. Rune, thanks for coming on the Rewilding podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
So my first question is, how do you define animism? So and to preface that a little bit, I found your work through YouTube. I don't know how. YouTube maybe recommended it or somebody sent me one of your things. And your channel is Nordic Animism. And so that is one of the things that intrigued me as somebody who considers themselves an animist. I started following your work. And so for those who aren't familiar necessarily with the term, I thought it would be awesome to have you define how you see it.
Kind of the traditional old school dictionary definition of animism is that animism is the idea that everything is animate. But that is also a very rough idea, actually, and it's not necessarily always accurate because the dispersion of animacy in animist realities is uneven. Often there are places that are more important than others. There are others in a landscape that are more important than others. So therefore, like important contemporary animist scholar such as the British researcher Graham Harvey, he gives us a definition of animism, which is animism is that there are people in the world. Some of these people are humans, but they are all deserving of respect, and that term respect is actually really important in animism. It is that the world is full of beings and we should try to be decent towards one another. So that's one very basic. I then like to add on to that an important element of animism is that it is in the practice, it is in the doing. Like, it's not really animism when we shout of our printer when that refuses to print just before the deadline, right? It's not really, even though we are technically sort of enacting a kind of reality where it seems to have intention, right? It's not really animism. It would perhaps be more animism if we actually offered it a bowl of beer in order to actually start working in, or if we did a shamanic otherworldly voyage in order to get back the soul of the printer, put it back into the printer, and start working. Like, it's a little bit of a rough example because it sounds a little bit ridiculous with the printer working or not working, but I think that animism is the respect, but it is respect as enacted as something that we do. And that's something that I got very much from the Norwegian philosopher Arne Johan Vetlesen, who is thinking with panpsychism. And panpsychism is the philosophical idea that there is consciousness and agency dispersed throughout the world. And he has this idea that animism is panpsychism in practice.
That's awesome.
That also means, of course, that when we are part of a civilization or a culture that does not practice animism, then we are, in a sense, practicing non-animation on the world, which Vetlesen then says that is part of actually killing the world. The idea of the dead world is not just something that's in our heads, it's something that we act upon the world, which is why the world's dying.
Totally. Yeah, I had this thing, when I first heard that, the term animism was this blanket term for indigenous religions. I was like, well, they didn't realize when they did that they were doing the inversion of that as well. Because you could just say that inanimism is a blanket term for the religions of, colonial civilization or whatever, right?
Yeah. And that is very much a baggage that is still tagging along in the idea of animism, that is the other to the white observer. Totally. That is the one that are animist. And even in like folklore studies today, like originally there is this actually racism-based division in scholarship between anthropology, that's when we study the others, and folklore, that's when we study shit kickers with our own skin color, right? It's absolutely meaningless to have this distinction between folklore and anthropology. But in folklore studies, you still sometimes find people to say, "Oh no, there's not any animism in folklore," and that's absolutely weird. That you can have a human practice which engages a spirit in stones and trees, but you would actually say that's not animism.
Yeah.
Like, if that's not animism, then I don't know what is.
Super weird.
So there's these weird distinctions that are sort of tagging along a little bit.
So in terms of that, then the Nordic preface of your work, Nordic Animism, how does that come into play specifically?
Well, that's basically because animism is always place-based. It's always place-based. And because the important core of animism is relating, it is creating relation, then I got annoyed with a lot of the perhaps scholarship on relationalism and animism and so on, which is the most non-relational thing in the world, because people they describe this scholarship is expressed in a language that might as well be Babylonian, So that's part of it. That the Nordic is a cultural sphere or cultural box that people do understand, so people can relate to it, and it is attached to a specific place in the world, which means that it is relating to that place, and that's why I find it important to give it that preface. But a large part of my work I have found is also actually delving into, so what is it to be a majority person and work with animism? That involves a huge span of issues and intersectional struggles with whiteness and all these kind of things that are sort of implied in that, and that counts for all Euro descendants. So in a way, my idea of introducing a specifically Nordic animism is part of being inspirational or trying to work with inspiring an animist, you could say, majority traditional or Euro traditional knowledge paradigm for all Euro descendants, and also, for instance, for settler Euro descendants, where and what I would really what I have wanted to see, and actually it started happening a little bit, would be that people would make their own little something's animism. I saw that there was a guy who had he was starting to talk about Appalachian animism. And when I saw that, I was like, yes, that's perfect, because it's a place-based way of looking at these things. So yeah, and Nordic in itself is, is it one of those categories that you could say, how useful is it really? It has baggage in it, like everything in our language has baggage. Nordic also has a lot of baggage, and and when you think of animism as something that's place-based, you should also think, what exactly is being excluded from that? For instance, I've thought that there was a little bit of a problem in the framing of Nordic animism, that it tended to exclude actually the west side of what I actually really think is sort of the Nordic landscape space, and that's the British Isles. But you could probably also turn to the east and say the Baltic areas and so on. It's not really included in it that much. But if you go to those places and look at their folklore and their animist practice, you find that they have very, very, very similar things, because animism is about relating to a landscape. And if they have similar landscapes, in many cases, they have similar ways of relating to them.
Yeah, totally. That's awesome. Yeah, in terms of rewilding and connecting to place, a lot of people want, especially people of colonial descendant or settler descendants that don't have a connection back to their place, tend to either like culturally appropriate from local places and or reach back into heritage that is maybe more recent or has been transformed in certain ways, and end up reconstructing things in a maybe not so accurate kind of way. And one of my favorite things I think that I've heard you talk about is the difference between reconstructionism and re-engaging. And it's interesting to see it from your perspective, because you're actually like you're not a colonial descendant, right? I mean, you live in Scandinavia, like you're living where you're from, where your ancestors recent and beyond are from, right? And so I'm curious if you could speak to that just for a little bit on the difference between reconstructionism and re-engagement.
Yeah, I'll just add one little
Cool.
comment to me being colonial or not, because yes, I am myself First Nation in the country where I live. I don't apply the term indigenous for logical reasons that you can probably guess, but First Nations, but in Europe there are multiple situations of abuse between different groups, and also abuse between majority Euro descendants, so like myself, and indigenous groups. The state where I am part of the majority population, Denmark, has, for instance, been part of colonial projects in northern Scandinavia towards the Sami, also in Greenland towards the Inuits in Greenland, which they are continuously actually linked with the Danish state, and we also actually were deeply involved in the colonial slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. So just a little decolonial disclaimer there. I can't claim to be outside that whole thing.
Sure.
And I don't, and I shouldn't. So but Reconstructionism. Reconstructionism is a kind of Nordic heathenry, which looks at or as I understand it. There might be people who understand it in a different way, but as I have understood it, it's a way that looks at a very specific period in the very distant past and then tries, as the name says, to reconstruct as faithfully as possible into our age the ideology and worldview and religion of that age. I think it's very interesting actually that people are trying to do this. That it is as if there is a strong will, there's a strong religious drive in it, but it has some serious methodological problems. Um, when you are looking for something such as Viking Age religion, then you are looking at very problematic sources written centuries after this religion was actually practiced by Christian saga writers or chroniclers, right? And that places you in a historical academic distancing and source criticism situation, which means that it becomes a mind project.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes scholasticism. You are not, when you're practicing that, you're sort of in this mind game space, as I perceive it, where the idea of being historical, being aligned with that distant past, becomes the criterion for validity. Now, the problem with that is that, dude, nobody wants to be Iron Age.
Right.
We don't
Right.
want to live in the Iron
Yeah.
Age.
Yeah.
But people sacrificed human beings, and there were sacred kingships, and it was a slavocracy, and like Noah.
Yes.
It's like, and so
Yeah.
that's one problem. But
Mm-hmm.
even if we, imagine for the sake of reason that we wanted to live in that age, you cannot transport things between contexts like that. You have to take a starting point, and that's when I'm talking about re-engaging
Mm-hmm.
or dialoguing or recovering or building relation with. You have to build a dialogue with these pasts, and that dialogue can enrich us today. We don't want to sacrifice human beings. In some ways, I think that in some ways I actually think that our social systems actually do sacrifice human
Sure.
beings because we
Absolutely.
sacralize violence by the way we
Totally.
talk about violence in public space, and that is sacralizing violence. That's actually, in a way, that's human
Mm-hmm.
sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that we should say, okay, so then it's okay.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if I was making the
Yeah.
points there.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel very similar. As a settler descendant living in Portland, Oregon, in the United States, I've been through like various phases of trying to sort of understand what my story is, what my identity is in that sense. Sort of like a Martin Prechtel calls a lot of people like orphans. He's an author that I really appreciate. But so like I went through multiple phases of like first rejecting everything in my past, like just rejecting all of it. Like there's nothing of value here. And then I went through a phase of like, actually, I'm really interested in, hearing where my family came from and all of the different things, and even up to the recent past. And so I delved into some like European history, like, I don't know if you've ever seen the Barbarians documentary by Terry Jones of Monty Python, but it's really good.
No.
It's hilarious. It's like a real documentary series, but he's led by him, so he makes lots of jokes all the time. But it's cool. It's like the archaeology that existed outside of Rome versus the propaganda that Rome said about everybody else, and so that made me actually appreciate, even though I still agree with you in terms of like fuck the Iron Age or it was all of the bad things about the Iron Age. It still gave me a deeper appreciation of a lot of those things pre-Rome. And then
I
at the
also
same, go ahead.
I also think that in a sense, it's not about saying, I don't know, fuck the Iron Age. It's more about
Yeah.
saying, like, if we are, for instance, working with relation, and then we're also working with, perhaps ancestry, and we are looking in our own heritage for threads of relation, then that material, for instance, like what happened in Iceland was that an incredible and, in a European context, absolutely unique material was preserved that actually preserves these pre-Christian voices from there. And these pre-Christian voices they're there for us today, and they're weird and
Yeah.
and they're mysterious, and they are powerful, and they have so much wisdom to bring into our time. And that, so I also don't think it's important when we talk about this reconstructionism versus re-engaging, or the other way around. It's important to not think about culture as this kind of whole package where we're buying the whole thing. Like, no,
Totally.
yeah, we don't want to be Germanic barbarians that during Roman era,
Right.
but that doesn't mean that their songs of wisdom are not cannot be inspirational and be part of where we come from.
And I think that's something that I deeply, rejected, I think, for a long time, until, I have a lot of friends who are constantly arguing with me about it. And to the point where there's actually, just like how even in Mexico, for example, there are like animist pre-Christian stuff in Catholicism now, that there's always nuggets of things that are preserved and transformed in particular ways and hide in these colonizing religions or whatever, right? And so thinking about it from that perspective, and like trying to approach that through sort of like, what are the actual thing, where's the like hidden animism in some of this stuff, and then I went through another phase of like, well, because during that phase, learning that if gods are place-based, and a lot of the particular characters and gods and things in a lot of these pagan animist religions were in those places, then they're not actually here. So it'd be weird to, like, for example, for me to like worship Odin or anything along those lines if I don't even live anywhere near the place where they actually existed. And that, people would give offerings to gods of the particular places as they went along. So then I was like, okay, well, what are those spirits or gods or whatever here in this place? And I started learning the language, Chinook Wawa, which is the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde heritage language. And they have storytelling in the wintertime at the classes. And so I got to help translate some of the stories from like the English back into Chinook jargon, or their original languages, like a language called Kikst, which there are no longer many speakers of. And that was translated to English. And then we were translating it from English into Chinook Wawa, which is like a trade language here. But it still carries all these things. And so it was cool to sort of like be a part of that. And, I've been invited to some of the Longhouse winter gatherings here in the Northwest. And to just sort of see this multifaceted perspective of like, I have this sort of muddled history of how I got to be here. And now I'm trying to find a place in this place that's here that has these remnants of things with all this other stuff on top of it. And it just makes me think, one of the things I really like about the way you present all of this stuff too is just how messy all of it is, and how culture doesn't have like these distinct borders.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it?
It really is. It's like, but it's also like so complicated, because I feel like people really want to have these like defined things, but really we have to dwell in complexity.
Yeah, totally. Did you learn actually Chinook Wawa?
I am a fluent speaker in Chinook Wawa. Yeah, I was an assistant teacher there for about a year.
You say it's a trade language, so it's fairly easy to learn, like Kiswahili or something.
Totally. Yeah, there's only 600 words, cool. And it's sort of a simplified grammatical structure from Kikst, which is the Chinookan language that was mainly here. Yeah,
cool. That's really awesome. I would also just add one comment to the this idea of place-based gods, and that is that I also think, like, for instance, when you think of the type of gods that were there in many pre-Christian European religions that are similar to the ones that you find in for instance, Afro-diasporic Orisha religions, and a number of different peoples around the world have that kind of cosmocratic deities of the Odin type, right? One thing is that they might have place-based aspects. However, they're not. I don't think they're completely place bound. If you look at and I think the Afro-diasporic religions that are this extremely vibrant and powerful way of creating resilient animism in our world today. I mean, I seriously think that those people, they're the ones that are going to be remembered in like 400 years from now as like we remember the fathers of the Renaissance today or something like that, because this extremely effective way of building resilience to modernity it comes from these people. And there you also see that a deity like Odin or Shango, Shango might be located in or connected to the Oyo house in Nigeria, a part of the Yoruba, but he's also there in Cuba, and there are also sacred sites to Shango in Cuba, and perhaps and there are examples where, in fact, indigenous Brazilians who have been subjected to an absolutely horrifying process of colonization and atrocities of different kinds, that they are using Afro-descendant traditional religiosity to reclaim their own indigenous Brazilian spirituality in that place, because they lost it during that process of colonization. So this is just to say that I think that the place-basedness is not unambiguous. I think that I think Odin can be there in North America.
Yeah, I like what you said. Place-based isn't place-bound. I think that's a really good way of saying it.
Yeah.
It's reminiscent of when I was in my late teens. I was part of like a sweat lodge group in Portland, and they had lots of different native teachers coming through there. And I always felt kind of weird, like I didn't speak the languages of the songs we were singing, and oftentimes I would just sort of be a fire tender instead of in the lodge, just to be of assistance. But this one time we had a guy come, and he was a character. He was like Mongolian, but born in the United States, and had been adopted into a Lakota family and was like a sweat lodge for her. So he had this interesting history. But one of the things that he said before everybody went in was like, hey, when we go in here, we're going to be singing Lakota songs and all this stuff. But I want you to know that like what we're just using like the Lakota's key. But when the door opens, it's like your ancestors that are there. And when he said that, I was kind of like, okay, I can get behind that.
Yeah.
And it just seems kind of in a similar vein of like having that connection via different slightly different means of getting there. But
you see you get that a lot actually from indigenous peoples today, that well, we are a mess, all of us, when it comes to well, not a mess. Our descent is a mess.
Yeah.
I'm fairly unambiguous, but I'm the exception, and my children are not unambiguous anymore, So we are very composite. And when we then have people with authentic indigenous spiritualities who are working with that, then you suddenly have like Lila June Johnson, if you know her, this Dine, I think she's Dine Cheyenne, or anyway, she's indigenous American, but she also has roots in, is it Wales, something like that? And then she's honoring also those ancestors. And you also get that from indigenous Australians, actually, because they have these also, or some of them have very powerful relation to ancestors. And to them, these ancestry, they are dream lines that go back in their history. And they can't just disregard a dream line that goes to Brittany in northern France just because it perhaps doesn't align with being with whatever identity you might have right now. So these people are sometimes coming and very kind of focused in a very focused way in re-engaging European ancestry, actually.
Yeah. One thing that a term you used that I'd never heard before was Finfara. Is that right? Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
Can you, does that relate to kind of what we're talking about in the sense of like, in particular, well, why don't you define what it is and then then I'll see if I can.
Yeah. Let me, like, when we think about religion or culture, like we spoke about before, we tend to imagine these sort of wholes, these consistent systemic wholes. But spirituality, animist spirituality, for instance, is not like that. It's much more like there are some technologies, and these technologies are about creating relation to different others and different parts of the land and different phenomena and so on. Um, and that also means that when you think of it like that, then the whole thing about whether something comes from one cultural space or the other becomes a little bit less important. It's a little bit more like, okay, so there's a wheel here that can be used. It doesn't matter if you're an Aztec or an Olmec. Well, I actually don't think they had wheels, but
Yeah.
in principle, you know,
yeah.
you can use it. And then spirituality is viewed a little bit like that. That also means that going to other people can be very inspiring, perhaps. And we can see in some of the old Norwegian laws from when Norway had just become Christian that the Norwegians, the early Christian Norwegian, they had laws against something that they called going to the Finns. Now, the Finns is an Old Norse word that means the Sami, right? So fara at finnar spyrja spa. That means to going to the Finns to ask for the second sight or to learn the second sight, or just fara at Finnmarker. That means going to the Sapmi, to the Finnish areas, or gera Finnfara, doing Finnfaring. That basically means visiting the Finns to acquire animist competence. And that was banned in these early Norwegian laws. So we don't know exactly what they did, but it looks like, because these things are banned, it looks like that there are explicit laws against these practices. It looks like that must have been a thing that people did. They went to the Sami to spyrja spa, to acquire animist knowledge, basically. So that means that cultural exchange between two groups of people that are rather different seemed to have been almost a constant cultural practice. And for us today, that is a weird thing to think about. Like, imagine that becoming a Christian pastor, you do that by getting knowledge from the Muslims. And that is a little bit like a codified value. You know, you have to go and visit the Muslims, and you learn.
It makes me think of I think it's called Ramspringer. It's like the Amish tradition where they they go out and have to kind of like live in the real world, or not real world, but the normal core world or whatever, and then go back or not, right? Like that. It's like a trial by fire or whatever. It's one of their rites of passage. Like, that's really interesting.
Cool. I thought about it in the same moment, actually, the Rumspring in there. And I think it does have some relation, but that particular ritual also has or ritual complex also has some sort of what we call a liminal meaning. It's a little bit like when African groups, they send youngsters into the bush. Because then they are outside the culture in order to return to the culture.
Totally.
So there's also that in that particular ritual. But perhaps Finfara could have had that function. Who knows? I mean, we don't know. But you know, when you reach a certain age, you need to go live with the Sami for a period, and then you come back. Who knows? So
it also makes me wonder. You know, anytime things like that are outlawed, it's like, why was it a threat? What about it was threatening to the state? You know?
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. Like, and I think that like I've become quite inspired by this Australian Aboriginal Australian thinker called Tyson Juncker Porter,
Mm-hmm.
and he talks about how, in his perspective, indigenous knowledge is very much about linking with other and having building transformational complex relations that allows for a very transformational but also very stable, paradoxically, form of indigenous knowing. And if you are building a state and you want a military power, perhaps you even have ambitions of building a bit of an empire, as some southern Scandinavians had in the Middle Ages, um, like then like Christianity is more useful than as a general ideology than something that is more pluralist in its animacy, if you
Mm-hmm.
can say it like
Mm-hmm.
that. Traditional animisms, they're much more fluid and much more
Mm-hmm.
transformational, and people's allegiances are much, much harder to control. And that means that in Northern Europe, at least, you see that state formation and the consolidation of Christianity, those two things, they just go
Mm-hmm.
together. They go
Mm-hmm.
hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
So Christianity in Northern Europe, it wasn't implemented in this sort of violent colonizing way, but it was implemented by elites. It was implemented by elites who were locking themselves onto European um, infrastructure of power in order to become powerful nobles and earls and kings and whatnot. So that if you wanted to be a powerful person in 10th century Northern Europe, you would want to be Christian because then you could marry your little girl to somebody who was also powerful,
Right.
and you couldn't do that if you were a heathen because everybody else had
Mm-hmm.
already become Christian. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so there's that aspect to Christianity. So that practices that make people's self-image and make their relation and make their entire connectivity fluid and transformational. That is that it sort of runs counter to this quest for stability and uniformity that is sort of implied in the state
Mm-hmm.
building project.
Totally.
So I would say that this is the reason that Finfara is like climates could change a little bit, and all of a sudden your stable sedentary peasantry that produces a lot of grain that they pay in tax to your church and your kingdom or whatever, all of a sudden they're not there anymore. What? Where did they
Mm-hmm.
go? They're walking behind goats in a different area. That's well, they
Yeah.
changed.
Yeah.
They changed. Perhaps they just decided to become nomads again, and kind of that regularly happens in human
Mm-hmm.
history. We
Mm-hmm.
have a tendency to even those of us who are really left wing and all that, we still have this tendency to perceive human history in this movement where we go from little groups that are nomadic and egalitarian to bigger tribes that are a little bit more chieftain based, to kingdoms, to empires, and that kind of thing. That there's this kind of inevitability towards greater social complexity. But in actual fact, it's not the way human
Mm-hmm.
history works. When you look at what actually happens, it regularly happens that groups of humans say, well, in Middle East, for instance, this happened, that people said, well, now we tried this whole business with city states and sacred god kings and all that stuff, and why don't we just go back and become more sort of landscape based nomads and have some camels and little families and clans and live in that way. And humans have humans sometimes make that choice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a thing like Finfara would could be a channel for these kind of changes to occur. So if you're a state, you don't want it, basically.
Yeah. It's awesome. I mean, it makes I mean, it's not awesome, but it's that was a great explanation. Um, yeah, it makes me think about just subsistence practices in general and learning other things and having the ability to transform those, as well as the subsistence strategy itself and how that relates to a notion like animism, for instance, where, you mentioned the grain-based, taxation strategy, right? Like the word colonize comes from the Roman root colere, which means to till the soil. So the word was like literally the empire forcing other people into their grain-based taxation regime. And I think in terms of like Christianity, like you were saying, that tool was such a good tool for colonization for whatever, all the different reasons. Yeah, I'm also a huge fan of Tyson. And I was listening to his, I'm thankful. I had the book on my shelf for like a year and I never read it. And then I was traveling somewhere and I was like, oh, I should just download the audiobook for this because I've been wanting to read it for a while. I'm so glad I listened to the audio version of it and didn't read the book because he's just so funny. Like I feel like some of the humor wouldn't have read as much on the page, and then I was really surprised when he interviewed John Zerzan in one of the chapters, because anarcho-primitivism is essentially where rewilding emerged from. In the same way that you said, like panpsychism is the philosophy and animism is the practice. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing what I feel like anarcho-primitivism, or what now they call primal anarchy, is sort of the philosophy, and rewilding is like the doing of it, in certain ways anyway. That's not the whole picture.
I'm not particularly schooled in what rewilding actually is, but in some ways, I have sort of thought a little bit about what I do as a kind of a cultural rewilding.
Mm-hmm.
Like
totally.
I've thought if that metaphor would perhaps work as a way of basically thinking with animism today, majority animism.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it is, and I feel like the word wild has all kinds of connotations, which makes it super challenging. And then also the word rewilding itself. It was coined in Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, in the 1980s by Earth First, and then it diverged into two different definitions. One was the conservation rewilding, which it's known for mostly now, and then the other element was the sort of anarchist form of rewilding, which was returning to that relationship with nature that we've had prior to colonization and prior to agrarian colonization, which predates a lot of what we think of as like capitalism, for example. Not necessarily returning to it in a sort of like going back to living the way that we did 10,000 years ago, but returning to the relationships that we had with place, that were in reciprocity or whatever, right? So anytime there's like the state thing, like the outlawing of that, it's clearly there's a reason for it, and it's clearly about control. But it also makes me think about, which is where I wanted to go with this, like the animist connection to subsistence strategies, and how I think prior to getting stuck in these cultural systems, animist societies, there's plenty of like animist societies that went off course in terms of reciprocity and damaged their environments. But I think because they had that fluidity and they weren't necessarily stuck in like this colonial framework, they were able to figure out new ways of existing and new ways of resilience. And so I think animism, because it has that sort of like fluidity, and constant refreshing of relationship, it's this sort of it's another perspective on how to be in a place and recognize when things are maybe going in a direction of ecological collapse or unsustainability, or however you want to phrase it.
That's a really awesome point. I haven't thought about that before, but it's a really good point, that the transformational character and fluidity is basically part of an animist response also to dysfunctional ways of being an animist. Like what some of the biologists say is that, well, what happens to biodiversity on every single continent is that you start to find arrowheads, and then biodiversity just goes whoop, and this big what is it called, megafauna just disappears.
Totally.
When human comes, they eat everything, and that loss of fauna is a huge damage to biodiversity because these are keystone species.
Exactly.
So this and then and this is something you need to reflect with when you think with animism. You need to include that in how. So it's not like animism is not going to make us angels
Yeah,
anymore
exactly.
than Christianity is going to universally make people merciful, or that Islam is universally going to make people just, or that Buddhism universally is going to make people zen. In fact, I think a lot of Buddhists are fairly stressed people.
Yeah.
And animism, animists have regularly behaved extremely disrespectfully to their environments. Like the first thing that Scandinavians did when they came to Iceland, which is a very fragile environment, it's kind of this volcanic, isolated island place there. First thing the Scandinavians did when they came there was to cut down every single tree. When Scandinavians have been there for like, I don't know, 150 or 200 years, there was not one tree left on Iceland. And so humans are also humans, you know.
Totally.
But it's an amazing point that you're making, that the fluidity of animist culture is that it's perhaps it is in that the paths towards betterment are found.
Totally.
Like I've been thinking that with regards to the loss of the megafauna, that animism could perhaps animism as such could be seen as a response to that cataclysm.
Absolutely.
But I think your idea there adds another layer of complexity to animism as an ongoing response as a learning process, which is with animists. Yeah.
You froze for a second.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. There's a author in the United States called Martin Prechtel. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's like half Canadian native, half Swiss, but was raised on a Navajo reservation and then lived for 10 years in Guatemala and was adopted into like the Tutsigol Mayan village. And he talks a lot about the Mayan religion, and they have this concept of like spiritual debt, where like your life, to make your life, you rip a hole from the living world. And because of that, you have to spend the rest of your life giving ritual offerings to pay off that debt of, you know, your existence. And then anytime you do anything like make a knife, for example, you have to do like rituals for extracting the minerals or the rocks. You have to do ritual for like every process. And so technology becomes super expensive in a ritualistic way. So they basically ritualized regeneration and disturbance in this way that makes it's like basically a cultural limitation to growth, a cultural limitation to consumption by ritualizing it to the point where you're like, oh, I don't want to go make a knife because I'm going to have to do all these songs and all this ritual and stuff. And he jokes about how like an automobile would be like 1,000 lifetimes of ritual reimbursement. And so they just, after, you know, this is 500 years after their civilization declined or collapsed. And, you know, is this a lesson? Is this a part of their philosophy that was because of that, right? And the animism allowed them to adapt and generate this newer idea. And it's the same with
badass. I'd like to read that guy.
Yeah, I'll send you some links.
Sounds somewhat similar to ideas that I encountered from the Maori. The Maori had this idea of like they have these spiral ornaments. I read about it somewhere. There was a Maori describing it, and these spiraling patterns represent sort of the entanglement of creative and destructive sides of the cosmos that are always there. And if you are shaping something, if you're making whatever, if you're carving a figure out of a stone, you're actually engaged in violence from the cosmic perspective, and you need to acknowledge that ritually. So you are, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, now I want to read about that. I mean, I basically feel like there's some level of even non-animist religions, I feel like, have been trying to figure out ways of doing this kind of stuff, like Jubilee, which is the Jewish tradition of like forgiving all debts and freeing all slaves every 50 years. Like there's some sort of desire, I think, deep in people to be relatively egalitarian,
Yeah,
even though our societies have shifted so far from that. Um,
totally, totally.
which
Yeah.
makes me kind of think too, and I want to come to this in terms of one of our challenges, I think I say are like both you and I in different ways
Mm.
are um, working with white supremacy or dealing with white supremacists in terms of some of the reconstruction, in terms of like entryism and fascism within our movements, within our ideas. And I'm curious if you want to talk about that at all for a minute.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a constant, like if you are engaged in anything that has to do or has a point of contact with something that's Euro traditional, then uh you are in some point of contact with stuff that fascists have been loving and cuddling to little bits and pieces throughout history. And and I think that fundamentally the that there are some complex and interesting and extremely damaging cultural processes that go on in the history of those people that were to become white people. When what basically happens is that as we have become colonizers, part of that colonization is turned inwards on ourselves. Now, we haven't been exposed to genocides and land thefts and assimilation, boarding school programs, and these kind of things. We haven't been exposed to that. We still have our own languages, but we have been submitted to a knowledge hierarchy, what the Maori scholar Linda Tuiwai Smith calls a knowledge hierarchy, where specific kinds of knowledge are deemed right and white, importantly, and other kinds of knowledge, animist kinds of knowledge, are deemed out and actually non-white. So, and that would have sometimes been explicit. So when you see sometimes the judgment that is levied on Europeans who didn't comply with the standards of whiteness, believing in a dead exterior world, rationalism, and these things, then they're sometimes compared to African savages and stuff like that. But this is racism that's actually weaponized in controlling European populations. Part of that is that then a lot of that cultural material that's attached to that is taken in and made part of the building of nationalism. It basically becomes like postcard tokens of nationalist building of identity and identitarianisms. So a sacred site is not a place you walk out and engage. It's a place you stand and you look at and you admire and you feel cathartically, identitarianly Danish if you're Danish. It's in Denmark, right, or whatever. It would be the same in Scotland, but it's not. And in some cases, even to this day, I've heard that it's illegal for people in Sweden to go and put little coins in cup marks, they're called in English, which are or ball dicks, which are little holes that are cut in rocks, and they are ancient. They're from the Stone Age, man, and people still want to put little stones in them, not put little coins in them or rub butter in them or something like that. But that is sometimes illegal because it's a cultural heritage site. It's cool. It's a cultural heritage site, but the practice is also heritage, Now, so part of that has then meant that a lot of the material, which is actually Euro animist material, has then been sort of mined into extreme forms of whiteness, militant whiteness, white supremacy, and all these kind of things. So that today creates I always call it like an architecture of whiteness, where it's as if whiteness is shaped like a ball itself.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in there and you're a normal, decent person who's having a little job and living a normal bourgeois life, then you cannot move out of
Mm-hmm.
that normality,
Mm-hmm.
because if you want to stray away from modernity, then you're going to have to approach stuff that looks a little bit too much like very big, muscly, very short-haired dudes who carry banners, right? And so there's that sort of, and I think that is basically, I think of it as a defining paradox of whiteness, that that a lot of people, we can't get out of it because those
Totally.
roads, they're blocked by flipping Nazis.
Yep.
And uh and that's part of why it's that this is a constant intersect, like dealing with the knowledge, the modern knowledge hierarchy, the modern hegemon, the domination of the idea of the dead world. That implies a very direct anti-racist struggle against these things. It basically requires to take some of it back or to conquer new ground. Some of it you can't take back. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like you starting to wear swastikas and stuff like that is a pretty bad idea, because
Yeah.
you know it's not going to happen. There's too much suffering
Yep.
associated with such
Yeah.
an image. But there are other parts of imagery that you can work with and you can take it back. Like, I don't know if you saw on my channel
Mm-hmm.
the raven flag, which is a symbol that it was perhaps a little bit tainted. I mean, when I
Mm.
started working with it, I had a little bit of a feeling that perhaps it was like American bikers who had it as tattoos, these kind of
Yeah.
things. I was a little bit like, okay, uh, but but it hadn't been, taken in to that swastika
Mm-hmm.
level really.
Totally.
So I was like, okay, it's actually a really, really cool symbol that has some amazing, beautiful meanings attached to it, of relationality and totemism and kinship with others in land and all that stuff. And that can be so visible when it's merged with the mosque, in that traditional way. So so doing stuff like this, like, then the quest for land connectedness and culture of land connectedness is simultaneously an intersectional struggle to basically own stuff away from white supremacists. And and I think it's incredibly important to just keep that struggle on, because
Mm-hmm.
it's not just about some privileged white hippies who like some you know occult looking symbols to fashion their hippie self-image, which is not particularly important. It's about the the big global problem of 2.3 billion euro descendants being sort of trapped in modern whiteness, or whiteness defined
Mm-hmm.
modernity.
Mm-hmm.
So and I think that part of the way that we can deal with that is doing things with it. So, for
Totally.
instance,
Yep.
I have really tried to reach out, for instance, to eco activists, and because that actual action, that activism, that's doing things, and if they wanted to work with me somehow, then that in itself would be part of associating the things I'm clearing the path where the things I'm working with becomes disassociated from shit kickers with Harley Davidson's big muscles,
Mm-hmm.
and gets associated with those people that will be remembered in coming generations as
Mm-hmm.
those ancestors that our descendants are proud of, basically. Um, yeah.
So, and you modified the symbol, correct?
I wouldn't say modified it. I combined. What I did was I looked at different. I looked at different archaeology, and then I combined. So I basically
Mm,
uh, the head is inspired by a little bit inspired by some archaeology, and the tail a little bit by
mm,
some, and the wings are inspired by this very famous image of which might be an actual Viking Age image of the raven,
mm,
um, and so on, and the mask. So I looked at these Iron Age fibula where these raven shapes have masks inside them, a little bit like those Chinook speaking peoples where you live. They probably have, some of them have masks for raven totem masks that can open, and then there's a human face inside. That is a totemic mystery of entanglement between the human totem clan member and the raven. And you can see that raven totemism in Northern Europe have worked in very similar ways. So
mhm,
you see these human faces inside raven bodies.
mhm.
So it's that image that I sort of put together with the
Yeah.
inspiration from different archaeology.
I mean, one of the reasons why I think that's really cool, well, aside from the fact, like, I think it's like it directly expresses re-engagement as opposed to reconstruction. Like you're taking things and you're not trying to reconstruct some ancient thing. You're re-engaging with these different things. You're connecting them. You're making pieces, and then you're putting them out into the world in real life and infusing them with the beliefs that are behind them in terms of like having people that activists, direct action or whatever, carry the flag with them. Like, um, it's just cool to see like that thread, like instead of trying to recreate something, you're bringing it back up, letting it turn into something else. It makes me think of, have you ever heard of the movie Pet Cemetery? It's like a
Yeah, I
thing
think.
where animals die, they bury them and then they do some sort of like ritual or something to bring them back from the dead. And my friend always used to make this joke about languages that when they go extinct or when the languages go to sleep or whatever, like you can bring them back. And this is the saying in like Pet Cemetery, like you can bring them back, but they're not going to be the same. And it's like, it's sort of this, bringing something back from the dead is maybe not the right way to do it. It's like planting those seeds that we had and letting that
Mm,
new thing come and grow and turn into something else. But
yeah,
the roots go back, right? And so I just think
yeah,
about it in that sense, like it may have been cut away and the new shape that it's taking out of those roots is different, but it's still
yeah,
that threaded connection. And I feel like what you do is just like such a good example of that. um my challenge is how do I do that in a place that I'm not from, or that
yeah,
my ancestors aren't from, and I've
yeah.
had like fantasies of asking you to connect with a Chinook artist friend of mine to sort of co-create a thing that would be representative of sort of a fusion of different cultures coming together, in the back of my head for a while. Don't know if that will ever happen or, what that would look like, but just in that sense of like trying to find um, both threads of my own cultural heritage and history, threads of the place where I'm at now in the history of this place,
Mm,
and then also thinking about where collectively we are going to go from there, right?
yeah.
Like,
No,
and
I think, yeah. I think that is extremely important considerations. You were saying something before where I also thought about it. That thing about that connectivity when you're a settler. Uh, that how do you phrase that in relation to the danger of becoming appropriative, and so on. And I think that particular schism is, I think it's one of the defining questions of
totally,
our age, and
yeah.
I don't think a lot of people are, maybe a lot of people like you have that question in mind, but it's of like stupendous importance for the world, basically. To that, and that's also why I think like stuff like combining a flippant Scandinavian with a Chinook artist in order to do something. Uh, I think that stuff like that is super important, perhaps because it is playful. It is kind of this straying generously that I talked about in one video, that you're exploring something somehow, and yeah, you might trip and fall, but if stuff like that is done in playful ways, or in playful and respectful ways, then it ought to be possible. It has to be possible, it has to be possible to create meaningful land connectedness, and it has to be wrong. It has to be wrong that should not be there. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yes.
I mean, how many hundreds of millions of settlers are there settler descendants are there in North America?
Yeah.
It's like the statement that these people should not have access to land connectedness. In my view, it's evidently morally wrong, and that's not because I want to disregard any indigenous land rights. Like, I don't know a lot about indigenous issues in North America, but my impression is that what these people have gone through is absolutely atrocious and beyond description, and deeply morally abject, and that stuff like a very uncompromising respect for these peoples and their cultural rights and their land rights and their ownership is, of course, like the evident position to take for any decent person. But that cannot imply excluding all other Americans from land connectedness. That cannot. Those two things must go together. You know, they must. And I think the cultural challenge of what you're talking about there is a defining challenge of our age, figuring out how to land connect settlers or settler descendants. And I don't have a finished question answer to that. The best thing I can say is that, yeah, stuff like mixing Chinook with Nordic, that as a playful thing, I would say, yeah. But that's not. It's not probably not the finish. That's just
yeah, right, thing. Exactly. Yeah, and to get there to begin with, having the trust of an artist who would want to collaborate, a Chinookan artist, there's like, in my Rewilding 101 class, there's 4 sessions, and the third one is called kinship in Rewilding, and basically the majority of it is about how to integrate into a place as a settler and with the people of the place. And I mean, all of it is just my own experimentations and experience in doing stuff. So it's not necessarily that I have all of the answers or anything like that. I'm still just, failing my way through it myself. Yeah. So I agree that that's, one of the biggest questions of our era is how to integrate with that history. I think Robin Wall Kimmerer, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she has a really, she wrote down a thing that's been in sort of the milieu for a while, but this notion of the difference between a naturalized non-invasive species of plant versus a invasive species, and how there's lots of plants that are not from North America that are here now, that naturalized, that became a part of the ecosystem or absorbed into it, versus the ones that are thought of as invasive. And trying to sort of understand it from that, using that metaphor, right? Like, how do we become a naturalized, non-invasive? The whole premise of invasive species is actually kind of not real, or not that it's not real, but there are
could be brought to some unfortunate places.
There's a lot of nuance with it too, in terms of like, are species invading, or are they just adapted to disturbed soils from colonial agriculture or whatever? But that's a whole other conversation. Well, I really appreciate your time coming on the Rewilding podcast. Is there anything that you feel like, oh, I should say this, or any last questions you might have for me?
Not particularly, but except just saying thank you very much for having me on here. It was super, super interesting, and I really appreciate a lot of the stuff that you've been saying. So yeah, it was super nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Thank you.